Okay, we're live. Before we get started into the main topic of this conversation, I wanted to get your thoughts on the recent announcements, both from Google I/O and OpenAI's minor events.
I'm just impressed how a startup can spoil Google's lunch. That was impressive. We grew up on Google. So our most professional life, Google was this behemoth that was impossible to challenge. And then there's like OpenAI that is relatively new startup with just one product. And then with just very small production, very simple demos, like 3, 4 people on stage, talk about the products casually. And then after that, nothing Google presents is exciting. That that was the most impressive part, at least for my end.
OpenAI definitely invaded the airwaves. So it's just people can take so many new announcements in a week or in a day. And typically all the announcements in day one, people will start picking them up, like publications, news sources, people on Twitter, LinkedIn, just pick them up and start like sharing. So it creates this like huge wave of reshare content and just like amplifying the message, the features. And when OpenAI does it like the day before Google I/O, I think it definitely has that effect, especially when the stuff that they launch is quite impressive.
Even to the point where I didn't even bother watching the whole Google talk. I just saw like the highlights and then the summary of it. Because for some reason I wasn't that excited because I was like, okay, I wonder what kind of Gemini they're gonna announce.
Turns out there were a lot of exciting stuff. They have their, was it Project Astra, I think, which is pretty much like real time video model, right? So like video input, and then it just recognizes what's around, and that's done live. I don't know if you saw the video, the demo, but it's quite impressive. It's
Where she's
just
walking and then putting a speaker and it's like, what this is.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that I think that announcement was quite exciting, but I think because OpenAI launched something similar and did a live demo just the day before, it's like just by I think we got our share of excitement from the OpenAI's announcement, kind of made it seem less exciting, but it's really impressive in any way, right? It's still quite impressive tech, and definitely OpenAI is going hard at this and building good stuff.
And we've heard that from YC partners. Like, it doesn't matter if you're just a startup, you can still challenge established big businesses. And for us, it was a story, they say, but now we see it. We believe you.
I think now, yeah, with all this AI stuff, you believe, like we all believe, that pretty much any big company can be challenged. Distribution may be hard still for like startups, whereas big company, big enterprise, they have distribution. But I think on a technology and a product, yeah, for sure, it can be, anything can be challenged. If Google can be challenged, really anyone can be challenged. So that's really cool. That's exciting to see for sure. Anything else from the OpenAI announcement or Google I/O that you found exciting or that kind of scratch your imagination on what the future looked like?
I think I just appreciate I don't know how you call that skill in entrepreneurship. You're always trying to find something new, like you're in a new field and everything is unknown. And a lot of choices that you've made are like in retrospect, you can say, oh, I should have done that. I shouldn't have done that. This was a good call. This was a bad call. But it seems like the leaders at OpenAI, they're making a lot of good calls. Not only it's a startup, but it's also in a field like AI that's so new. No one tried that before. And being able to make those right calls in this brand new industry while being a startup, that's what impresses me the most.
Yeah, that's always really hard, right? Like every time you're doing a startup, there are a million things that you can go after, a million things that you should prioritize. And then yeah, sometimes it comes down to what you pick to prioritize. And that's execution, right? Startup in a team, good idea, you need to execute an idea. And executing it right also makes a big difference, especially in such a highly competitive market where there's a lot of well-funded competitors, lots of really smart people, and really motivated people. Takes a lot of smart people to think through that and being ambitious and having a goal and vision. Okay, so
What
enough
about
about
you?
what I thought.
What do you think is the future?
I think the personalized tutoring and teaching, personalized tutoring, teaching, learning is the future of education. Like we were talking about this in our last talk, right? But what we're saying was the world wants personalized, customized things. It's just we can't have them at scale or the right unit economics. And so I think more and more it's going to be more about personalization. So it's not one teacher teaching 50 people. It's like your teacher teaching you in the way that you prefer, in the way that you learn better. So that's a huge win. So it's exciting and it's wild. I think like kids in high school today or school or even earlier, actually, it's like everyone that has access to this is just going to learn way faster about more things in the world. I think what that will do to progress, innovation, ideas, it's just pretty wild. You can see that this might be an enabler for exponential acceleration in discoveries, in new technologies, just progress, right? Progress was already moving at an accelerated pace. If you look at what we've advanced in the last 50 years, it's definitely more rapidly than what we've done in the previous 50. And now this is like another inflection point where it's not just the internet where everyone can access information. It's like you access information in the way that works for your mental models. I think to be able to get there. So yeah, that's one. There's so many other things, but we could probably do like a whole other talk on that. Let's get back on track. Today, we wanted to talk about our journey through the DevOps and cloud infra, the whole thing. So typically, when you're a startup and you're software, you usually will build your products in the cloud. Most startups just find one of the clouds and then just build on that. So today we're going to talk about that journey that we took from basically figuring out which cloud to use and all the challenges, all the learning, all the excitement, and all the interesting things we picked up along the way as we're building products and how that looked like. So where do we start? We start with credits. What did that look like for us?
And all I remember is when we got our credits, I was so impressed that, oh my God, so much money for free. I was like, how can we convert them?
I'm sure every founder is thinking about that. And just for context, we're startup credits. So when you join an accelerator or when you're getting an investor, or even just now freely open, all the cloud providers like AWS, GCP, and Azure, they'll give startups how much money now? Like hundreds of thousands of dollars in compute credits. So you can use that credit for free to build your product. How much did we get? Do you remember?
I think it's 100 or 150,000 for like 2 years, right?
Yeah, it was definitely more than $100,000 or at least $100,000. And we could use that over 2 years. Actually, I remember, but before that, I think the clouds were providing a lot of startup credits, but they had these weird schemes or ways in which they gave them. So initially, they were just giving very little, like it was 10,000, 20,000. I think it was back when the cloud providers were experimenting with how do we incentivize or kick off this feedback loop where people build on our cloud. I think this might have been before they figure out how big of a lock-in the cloud is. And so they just started increasing the amount of money that they will give out to people as they understood that people make an investment in the clouds they have credits for. So I saw the trend because I was doing some projects before and yeah, like the credits, they were giving out credits, but it wasn't like 100,000. Now it's just an insane amount of money that you get for free.
Yeah, I remember GCP at some point was giving like $300.
Yeah, $300. Yeah, like what could you do that? You forget to turn off in a virtual machine and then it's just, you're done.
Yo, the first thought that crossed my mind when we got this $150,000 credit, I was like, I wonder if we can mine Bitcoin.
That's that's the thought everyone has. But then if you look at the fine prints, they explicitly say you can't do
You
that.
cannot.
It's like, okay, there goes the idea.
Our seed funds. Yeah, but I think we had this interesting idea on credits, like how they lock it in.
Yeah, people talk about this all the time. So committing to building a cloud, it is quite a learning curve, right? Like you need to figure out the ins and outs of like how they structure their resources and how to access them. I think at some point the cloud providers, they figure out providing cloud credits is addictive. Basically, they're selling like drugs to people. All the startups go take the money built on the cloud, and then you're $100,000 in, you realize that you can't leave easily. And so they get you. You've already figured out everything ins and out of the cloud. You spend $100,000 in that cloud. Presumably, you've found some success. You have some users, you have some customers. And at that point, you're locked in. It's really hard to just go. Now, it may have changed over the years as we've progressed, right? Like back when we started, I'm sure Terraform was there, but it wasn't like the thing that it is more recently, right? In the sense that people also realize that, hey, these cloud providers are giving us a lot of credits or locking us in. Let's figure out a way to do a multi-cloud now, right? It's like infrastructure as code.
I remember a lot of these services, like AWS Cognito, wouldn't let you export contacts. So you collected your users with their OS system and can migrate. because we were trying to move to OS 0 from Cognito while exploring both. And that was a big trap.
Yeah, I guess we were watching out for those kinds of lock-ins. It's hard. Like at the beginning, we're just trying to build something, but we were also planning for future. It's okay. We don't want to get locked in since we know there are some limitations to that particular product, and we may need to build beyond that. So the next thing I thought I would ask you specifically, since you have more experience with this, is what's your experience with the AWS console?
AWS Console is the first time I opened it, I had this image of you go to the commercial airplane like Boeing and then have this cockpit with like a bunch of buttons, bunch of screens everywhere. And then you're like, how do pilots understand all these buttons? Like, how do they memorize it? So when you go to AWS dashboard, there's so many services, so many icons. And every icon has 5, 10 pages inside with so many parameters, knobs you can tune and whatnot. It was overwhelming. I think that's partially why they give you so much credit because you have to spend a lot of your own time to learn this whole ecosystem, how it works. The user management is so complicated. It's very advanced and sophisticated, but like for most cases, it's like overkill. I think it's even more complex than our back permissioning system. When you just start like a software engineer, or like that's the first time you like even in DevOps or like building apps, it's overwhelming. So this whole console, I think it took me like a year just to get comfortable with it.
You can get full certifications on AWS to just learn how to like use the console to spin things up and architect things.
All those youth that make videos explaining how AWS works, man, God bless them. It's like such a saviors because every time I'm stuck, I'm just go to YouTube and then sometimes it's old video from old console and then you just map it yourself with the new dashboard. But the concepts remain the same.
Let's talk about the first product that we built. That was the Castodia. It was like databases to Google Sheets. So if you wanted to run reports and automate them, you could schedule a query from your production database or from any other database directly into your Google Sheets. And so if you had some formulas or some analysis charts, it would populate with fresh data and then your reports will be done for you like 8 a.m. in the morning and you could schedule this at any point. So we built a product like this. And this was early on when we hadn't really figured out like how to use infra. We were barely $10,000 into like our AWS credits. So what do we do then?
Yeah. I think when we started, we were such a noob. I remember setting up like our first server as a Flask server in Ubuntu because I knew how to use Ubuntu. And then just like hustling so hard, even SSH keys was like a big deal for me because I didn't come from classical software engineering background. I came from engineering to software. So all this SSH, like logging into EC2, then setting up Nginx, then spinning up the server. Then initially we were running like on ports. I remember like when I first saw like the IP of the EC2 instance with 8,000 ports, that was already magical that I can access that through my browser. But then it just keeps getting more and more complicated the more you go. But that was like when we first started. It was just pure EC2 Nginx Flask server. Then we learned how to map it with the Route 53, which is a domain name, so you can have a proper API. But then I remember there was a phase where serverless was all the hype. Bunch of articles writing about, oh, everything, you got to go to serverless. This is how Netflix does it. So then we start picking up Lambda, AWS Lambda, which is their serverless functions. And I remember at some point, like our whole backend was in Lambda. It was API gateway and Lambdas serving all our endpoints, which in retrospect was crazy. Like it's not very efficient. But to be fair, we also used MongoDB at some point for our database. That was
I
also
was really proficient at it only because we went through so many of the products and made all the mistakes that you make when you're starting out building infrastructure. One of the things I have a few comments on the serverless, but also I remember when you're starting out and you're building your first product, our intuition was, well, at the beginning it was just like, whatever, set up an EC2 and just have this one server. But then quickly when you start to think about, oh, now we need to launch it and we might have customers, then we're starting to think about scale a little bit. And maybe you can argue it's premature, not premature, but it's very common for startup founders to look for like platform as a service providers. So like you look for, when we looked into these ones like AWS Beanstalk, which is basically like your backend servers with auto scale and all the servers are managed by AWS. And then we had Amplify, which we mostly use to push our client code, like our application. Did you feel that way? Did you feel like it's just like a natural thing to start with platform as a
Yeah.
service? What are the pros and cons of doing that?
Yeah. I think after you hustled with EC2 and then Nginx and then Let's Encrypt, all that mess for a little bit, and then you discover Beanstalk and then Amplify, you impress because essentially it's handling CI/CD for you and scaling, which is the main benefit. So you just connect to a GitHub account, go into a branch, and that's it. It watches for updates on the branch and then deploys your Fast API or Flask server and then your React app. At first, it feels like magic. It frees up a lot of your time. And I think you can go pretty far with just Amplify and Beanstalk. You will hit limitations at some point, especially if your client is a bit more advanced, like a React app, because React has different node versions. And then Amplify is very particular about their node version. So they don't support the latest. They only support like the stable version that they've tried. And then they usually a little bit behind with updates. Beanstalk is all right. It's just a lot of hustle with the updating environmental variables as well. It's not as convenient, but it can get you pretty far. I think most people use it just to host backend.
I see. I thought people just use it for the back end, but I guess it could be everything. Just CI/CD, you code into it, and then it just spins up all the servers you need and auto scales them as you need. Yeah, I think I'm conflicted about the platform as a service. And so for context, platform as a service, the way I think about it is just managed services across the cloud so that you can very easily take code that you wrote as a software developer, as a software engineer, and it offset the need to figure out infra. Get my code, push it, and serve these to my users. And so the part where I'm conflicted is part of me feels like that's probably the right way to go for most startups, which is to just like build something, deploy it so that you can test and see whether people want this. And then after a while, like you said, it can take you pretty far and then only leave or exit or try to build more custom solution when like it absolutely breaks everything for you. Like you just can't stay in that platform as a service and then you have to move out, like for sure. So on the one hand, it helps you get started quickly, but it locks you into that particular configuration. So if you need to customize a package or like you need a different node version, you just can't have it. So then at that point, you're like, okay, now do I start from scratch just because I need like a node version 18 or something and Amplify only goes up to 17? So what are your thoughts on that? What's the right balance for startups too?
I think 90 to 95% of all the startups would be just fine with Amplify Beanstalk. You can definitely find product market fit. It will get you, I think, all the way to Series A, like Series B for most companies. You can build fintech there. You can build e-commerce. You can build most apps that are just an admin with some backend and database. It can get you pretty far. The only time you need to switch from it is when you need more control or your product is initially very complicated. Like you have this very fancy drag and drop interface that uses the latest, greatest node version, or your backend, like for some reason, it's just too heavy, processes files in there for some reason.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, I feel like if you're a certain kind of product or your company works on a certain kind of product, that should be how you restrict product, like overbuilding anything in the product. So if you're selling a B2B SaaS or enterprise solution, it's often more about this is a really painful problem that a very simple product would solve it. So in those cases, probably you just need something to push your code live. But if you're working on something where you're competing on maybe like an experience, a set of like very specific features or a way of doing things, you often will need more customization. And the other one is when you just need cost efficient scale. That's also when you're starting to get very deep into individual offerings that maximize that ratio of cost effectiveness and efficiency for you. I feel like the kinds of startup or the product you're working on could determine which way to go. We picked Beanstalk and Amplify because it helps us get started quickly. I think part of it is just like coming from the Python world and coming from, let's just write functions that solve a problem. It could fit that very nicely. And so Lambda functions, if you have that kind of setting, you start that way. one of my observations is that data scientists tend to start with Lambda functions. I don't know if you've noticed this pattern. Do you think it's a thing or no?
I have not seen that many data science people building backends.
That's exactly why. They want to run something, and Lambda functions just runs something where you just type in function code, right? So data scientists aren't software developers and aren't software engineers. And so function is a very natural mental model for running things, right? It's not like setting up a server, like a big server with a bunch of endpoints. It's just run this code.
Yeah, to be fair, I think Lambda is a great product. Like I'm a big fan. As clunky and as inconvenient, as buggy as it was, even back then, it was a pain in the ass to troubleshoot. It was a pain in the ass to deploy. It was so backward to build anything on it. Nonetheless, it was still something that I would still keep using it because
I
it just,
Yeah, I think for the right use cases, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so after this product, we built a different product, and this was like the early versions of Dropbase, where we could get a drag and drop a CSV and then import it to a Postgres database. So this was quite an intense product, but also like from an infrastructure perspective, it was a lot more complicated. And so the setup here is we wanted to offer like a cheap, low cost product for users to be able to spin up a Postgres database and seed that database with data from their spreadsheets, like CSV files, Excel spreadsheets. And so there were a lot of challenges trying to do this, right? Because if you want to do it low cost, you need to be able to spin up a lot of databases pretty much for free. Users would have expected some sort of free version of this where they can spin up databases and try it. So there's the database part, and there's also the processing spreadsheets, CSVs, Excel part, which is also processing intensive. So this is the setup. Like this is what we try to do. Do you remember what journey we took to figure out how to piece together this product from the DevOps and the infra side of things, like from the first version to what the later versions look like?
first versions were still very basic. I think it was still Flask for the backend, basic React for the front end. The backend was getting a bit more complicated because we wanted to give a database to every single user, and like smaller database. And we had no idea how to do this with Docker or with Kubernetes. So I think we went with ECS for that.
Do you mean for the database part or for the
Yeah,
CSV part?
for
No.
database.
So what I recall is, oh, so sure. The first version we had was I think we were just spinning up directly on an EC2. And then we tried to figure out a way to do it with Docker container. This was something I think Michael was working on way back at the
Yeah.
time. And but at the time we had no DevOps, no real like hardcore infra experience. And so we're piecing it together. And some challenges we had was like, how do we spin these up and shut them down in a controlled manner so that it would keep our costs low? But also we were really worried about security in having a bunch of Docker containers that could just talk to each other. And we were worried that people's data could be accessed by somebody else in a different container. And so we hadn't gone to ECS yet. That was a bit later when we were trying to process the CSV part. I don't know if you recall anything else from that time when we're trying to figure out how to spin up lots of Postgres databases cheaply, but securely.
We were such a noobs with Dockers. I think at some point we were trying to spin up Docker in a Docker.
I remember that.
Yeah. And then we also needed an address to give to our users, host and different ports. So that's what we're trying to figure out. And then we had some crazy ideas. I hosted in 2 different EC2s. And every time a user signs up, we just randomly assign them to one of those EC2s. And that's the address they'll be using.
That's the solution that we were architecting for this.
I think there was some kind of pooling that we built, PG Bouncer.
Yeah, I don't remember if we were exploring pooling at the time.
It was something like a reverse proxy for database. And then so it would route requests like URLs to the right ports.
So what I do remember is we were trying to figure out how to map all the ports. Yeah. So that was like you hit this address and then we would proxy it basically to the right container where, whatever that Postgres database was sitting for that particular user. And I don't know how we even try to make it so that it would shut off like after some time. But I remember we built this and it's working, but it was very complicated to troubleshoot it and set up. This was not built correctly. Like we just didn't have the experience.
And then I was looking at Heroku. I was like, I wonder how Heroku does it. And then I opened up, I signed up for like their free version and then free database Because at one point we had this discussion of, yo, let's just have one database and then create small databases within and then give each user their own set of credentials with access to just that one database. But then with the data grid, and we saw that a user with one database can see all other databases. They cannot access it, but they can still see like the names of the database or whatnot, how many databases are hosted in that database, also Postgres. So this is not gonna fly. This is not gonna be safe and blah blah blah. So then I went on Heroku, create a free account, and then I log in with database. I log in to Postgres instance with the data grid, and I see everyone else's databases. I was like, these guys did the exact same thing, what we were thinking. So after that, I think we switched. We set up this giant RDS. We totally oversized that, overestimating the demand for the service. And then it was like a lot of experimentation, studying and writing this query to create user with the right permissions, the right scopes per database.
Yeah, we should tell the story about when we were launching a version of this product. Do you know what story I'm referring to?
Which one are you talking about?
So okay, here's the setup. Picture this, right? This is the day before our launch. We're working on a bunch of new features for the latest and greatest version of Dropbase at the time, CSV to database. And so we're in a call with our DevOps engineer. And he asked us, hey guys, you're launching this tomorrow. What's the setup? What traffic? How many users do you expect?
I remember the story, and I'll tell another story before.
So I remember this very clearly, like it was yesterday, because we had a good laugh about it. So I remember we're sitting in our office, 8th floor, and I'm looking outside the window. It's sunny. And then he says, okay, so how many users do you expect tomorrow when you launch this publicly? And we said, let's make sure that we can concurrently handle at least 1,000 users, 1,000 CSVs being processed at the same time. And he looked at us and he said, okay, no problem. And then he sets up this massive sort of concurrent capacity or an infra. I think this is ECS already. And then we launched the next day and we're launching everywhere. And then we look at the usage and we have 10 users using it, not even concurrently, just like 10 users sign up for this thing. And I think this is such classic, like startup founder mindset. It's you're like very optimistic about building a product and just launching it. And then you're like, okay, millions of people are going to sign up for this thing, but let's just do 1,000 at a time. Let's just do 1,000 at a time. And then, yeah, you have a team, you have resources, and you say, okay, let's handle that capacity. And then they come and they're like, nobody shows up. You're like, oh, okay, that was cute.
Crickets, yeah. But to our defense, I remember another launch that was before this one, where we're building all these features, and then our interns are like, okay, we're launching it tomorrow. And our interns like, we don't have payment system yet. We haven't implemented payments. But God, no one's gonna sign up. We still have like 2 weeks. And in 2 days, someone's like, how can I pay for this? I'm like, oh shit.
I remember that very clearly.
I'd rather have those problems.
Okay, so just like launch and then fix problems as you go. I remember this very clearly because the night before I was working with him to figure out payment system. And this is interesting because this was the first time that we'd ever had to figure out Stripe. I think we set up something really basic, but it wasn't really working. It would work for like a basic use case, but then if you needed like a different plan, like it just wouldn't work. So that was an interesting experience. A little bit of both, right? But it's interesting if you launch something that you hadn't built payment system for, and then somebody asks you how to pay. It's a good sign. Anything else from the early to database experience?
I remember we spent so much time trying to figure out Docker. And then because ECS manages Docker deployment and everything for you, you don't have to go through this route of managing Dockers through Docker Swarm, or like Kubernetes. It almost feels like a magic, but at the same time, you don't fully understand how it works. So it's hard to troubleshoot. It was even hard to like log into tasks and like when it breaks, see why it breaks, because ECS just like, yep, it broke and just shut it down. And then you don't know, like it's working in your local environment. It's broken in deployed in prod. But we were troubleshooting, experimenting with it so long. I remember at some point we overcomplicated things so much that we were running our backend out of Fargate. And for the context, Fargate is meant for tasks, like primarily meant for tasks that are taking a while, scales up, but they're meant to be completed. The whole point of Fargate is it's managed instance that can execute task and then die. If you want something more permanent, you probably want to go with something like Beanstalk or ECS. But we over-engineered. At some point, we just, our brains fried. We've tried like Fargate, we've tried EC2 deployment. And the reason we use ECS is because we were processing files and we promised to process files up to gigabyte.
How did
Remember that?
I remember that. So maybe like PSA for founders building something that processes CSVs or Excel files. One thing you will find, especially with Excel files, is that Excel files are binaries. And so for you to do any kind of processing on the underlying data inside that Excel file, pretty much have to open the entire file, store it in memory, and then process it, right? And then depending on what language or what libraries or frameworks you use, if you use something like pandas, it'll blow out memory requirements to ingest, let's say 10 megabytes of Excel files, which no Excel file is that small anymore. You would need like 10 or 20 times the amount of memory available to just open the file. And so if we're promising gigabyte files, then you can imagine how much memory that ECS, that container would need to handle. And so those are very hard challenges. CSVs are a little bit easier from a amount of memory perspective, just because you can slice the CSV file and then just process in batches. But then again, if you're doing more of like a analytical, statistical, or when you're running something across the entire data set, you still need at some point to hold the entire data set in memory to be able to do something interesting.
Having gone through this experience, would you recommend anyone to work with CSVs? Any startup to tackle CSV space?
I think on a smaller subset level, yeah, I think unfortunately the world still runs on CSV files. And so I think for the smaller use cases where you're just getting a list of emails or like a list of like attendees to your event and you want to do something interesting with it, I think you still have to figure out how to solve that. But this idea or this vision where we could take all the CSV files in the world and just make sure there is structured data or accessible creatable data, it's really hard. It's a really hard problem. So we went through a lot of challenges trying to figure out this like technical, non-deterministic problem. Now, I don't know with the world of LLMs whether that problem can be solved better, but I'd imagine you still need to open big files to really understand what's inside. And really, databases are the best way to do this. It's just how do we get those files into some format that you can easily parse through? It's just hard.
I think it took us a while to learn this valuable startup lesson, which I think could be summarized as pick your battles.
Pick your
So,
battles.
yeah. So what we've done for a long time is we're going to this space and we're going to do everything. And then even when we said, okay, everything is too much, but we're going to take CSVs and we're going to do everything with CSVs. Even when that is too much, I think whatever you do, you need to find a subset that is most valuable and the easiest to solve for you and just tackle that. And then once you nail that part, then you can slowly expand. But we always went like breadth first, and then we'll take any CSV, any Excel. We're going to take any, open office format, like open source formats. We'll do everything, text files. And we just burned out by trying to tackle all of it at the same time.
Yeah, that was a painful experience. One of the things that didn't click at the time when we were doing this, it should have clicked, but it was hard. Do you remember when we launched the first version of the product? We could take a very clean CSV file and put it in your Postgres database with everything that's required. And then we'd have this constant experience where we'll talk to that user who tried to upload a file and they'll tell us that it failed or for whatever reason. And so we discover that there are more and more challenges or more just nuances of processing CSV files. So like the delimiters are different in CSV files. Sometimes it's commas, sometimes it's tabs, sometimes it's like semicolon. So that was one issue. And then there's the issue where the like header column has numbers in it. There's empty or it has some like weird French or Japanese character. And they say, oh, okay, there's encodings that you need to figure out, like process these files. And every time we would launch a feature to address like the previously discovered challenges in processing files, another user would come, sometimes the same users, okay, but now I have another file that has these other kinds of problems and I can't import it. And so it just felt like a constant, just like a moving target always, right? Like you fix a bunch of issues and then now we can import that previous file and then there's the next one. And so it felt like it just never stopped in terms of like how to deterministically solve a problem where you just want to take a file and you want to put it in a database. And so I think with the traditional approaches that were available to us, it was just very hard. And then we realized, hey, maybe this problem is just very hard to solve in the way that we're approaching it. I think with LLMs, maybe there's a shot at it, but that was our experience. So yeah, it's better to just find one very narrow case and then try to solve for that really well.
I remember when I lost it, there was a one user who was struggling to upload his files. And then he emailed us his file. Like, this one I just failed to upload. And we open it on Excel, looks fine. We open it in Pandas, looks fine. And then I spent the whole day troubleshooting it. I had to go down to opening it at the very basic format. And then it had this Excel would insert this one character, like special character, in the column name. That was some weird character that would just not display in Pandas or in Excel, like it's empty. But when you try to load it to database, this would be like, yo, this column name, I cannot name the column this way. This character is like prohibited. And the error message from Postgres wasn't clear enough. Pandas wouldn't show this error. And it was so complicated. And then I was like, man, like, how many of these nuances are out there?
Yeah, we caught a significant amount and it still felt like it would be a long time before we can catch them all. It's just a very hard problem to solve. I think we're shorter on time, so I want to skip
Okay.
ahead to what happens when your credits start expiring. AWS says you've got $100,000. You can spend it within 2 years. Most startups reach a point where they realize that they are experimenting a lot, spinning up a lot of infra, cloud services, and things become unwieldy. What was your experience then? And we went through this.
Yeah. So at some point, credits expire. And then you get your first bill, and that bill just slaps you in the face. And you're like, how? I only have a backend of a client and like a couple Lambdas running. Why am I bill like $10,000? And then you go through all 5, 10 accounts that you've created over the years, just playing around with AWS. Then you look at this cost explorer, trying to see what's burning all your money. You find some database that's running in some weird account, some weird region that you vaguely remember creating, but you don't know what that was for. The hygiene is horrible, at least when you're first starting with it, because you never label stuff. You never document. You just create resource, spin up EC2, spin up RDS. Here's another ECS cluster running like 5 tasks. Each one of them is named like test 1, test 2, test 3, something horrible. And then you're sitting there and your product is running. And you're like, if I delete this, will my product crash? Because I don't know if my product is even using this resource. Because I remember deleting one of those like for random EC2 instances and our scheduler crashed. Apparently, our scheduler for some reason was in Oregon region, whereas everything else was like in North Virginia region. So it becomes such a pain to even kill those resources. I remember shutting down EC2, but then all this like auxiliary resources or the backup image, the EC2, something else like that was still running. It's still burning money, even though you explicitly say terminate the image, terminate the instance. So it becomes very painful very quickly, especially if you have multiple resources. With EC2 and Lambda, it's very easy to manage them. So EC2 and Amplify, but we have Lambdas. You usually have few, and then deploying, updating, maintaining them is very painful. And troubleshooting. That's the go on.
Yeah, I remember a time when we were on Zoom troubleshooting this live together, and you're trying to shut off this EC2, and it would just keep spinning back up. You remember that? So we're like, okay, terminate, delete, and then we're like, why is it spinning up again? It took us a while. I still don't remember what happened, but I think it was like there was some ECS task kind of like dependent on that EC2, and
There
that
was a
thing was
rule.
alive. What's that?
There was some rules set up in EC2. There's another configuration that you can configure. You say, I need at least 2 EC2
Container service. So it's like the container service says, okay, you need at least one EC2 running all the time. And that was the one. So we kept shutting it off manually, terminating it manually. And it would do it. And then it would be like spinning up again. And we're like, this is a virus.
Even if you shut down ECS manually, then there's like another way that you can program your own rule to have 2 EC2s running always. So you have to find that somehow, to delete it, and then delete all the EC2s.
Yeah. So I think this like free and easy money that's coming from all these cloud promotional credits, they create this culture of abundance where It's like, hey, you need an EC2, just spin it up. You need something with a GPU, just go for it. Like we got credit, so let's just do it. Let's optimize for speed. But then it creates this habit where we're not really managing or labeling or maintaining the resources because we're not optimizing for it. But then when your credits run out and you have to put your credit card or get the invoice for expensive cloud services, then you're like, oh, damn, okay, it's going to burn all my money. It's just maintaining all the stuff that I don't even know if I'm using. And then you usually go backwards and try to figure out like, hey, if I turn this off, will a user complain? Or if I turn this off, will like my whole service go down? And it's just really hard to manage that.
I think one of the unintended pitfalls of AWS Console is that they want to simplify the whole process of creating a new resources because it's already so complicated. So they create a lot of resources for you. For example, when you spin up a Lambda, it's like, hey, do you want to create a new role for this Lambda? Yes. And then it will just assign some random name. It's not by date, it's just some random characters. Same with security groups, same with VPCs. And then they all connected, they will depend on each other. And then when you go clean this thing up, it's a mess. Especially if you want to delete like one stack, a VPC, you have to find all the security groups, all the subnets, all the route tables. Deleting VPC is a nightmare.
I hear pain in that sentence. So talking about messes, I still to this day, I think the biggest mess we've had is the time when our AWS keys were accidentally pushed to GitHub. Let's talk about that.
Dude, I don't even remember how they got pushed. So that means our GitHub repos were public?
No, I don't remember. Okay. We still don't know how that happened. I'm very impressed. At least those like crypto miners, they're just working hard, aren't they?
They're like on top of that.
So let's just for the audience, let's talk about the story from
Yeah.
top down. We were traveling. I think at the time, this was like we were in Thailand. And this was right before we started YC, right? We're like, let's hang out, let's visit somewhere cheap. And so we were there. And just before that, we'd been working with a few interns working on experimental projects. And one day, suddenly, we get an email saying that your AWS key has been compromised. Tell us what happened. What did we discover at this time?
Yeah. So first is a bit of a context. I think we were in this cheap ass hotel. I don't even know if you can name it hotel because like
It's like a backpacking hostel type of situation. It was
Dude,
dark.
like-
There was no natural light from outside, no window even.
dude, there was no fan.
It was so hot.
I think there was a little window, but there was no fan, no AC, right? There was no hot water. And then it was so damn hot. I just remember that. And then like two tiny beds, so rough. I don't know how we ended up with that little city. I'm just glad we had Wi-Fi access. So that's maybe we used our hotspot. I don't remember. But we're just sitting there. And it was after we came from those little festival or whatnot, like street market. We get this email. I'm like, what's happening? So I log into AWS and we're looking, and we had multiple EC2 instances spun up on every single region. And all of them were just working hard mining Bitcoins.
Yeah, we need to emphasize that. So basically, when you have an AWS account, you are pretty much free to spin up a virtual machine or basically an EC2, like a server, anywhere where AWS has a data center in. So we look at the account and we see virtual machines spin up in every single country where AWS is available. All like East region, West region, Europe, Singapore, like all the countries where there's a data center, there's just EC2s running. Now, these are not EC2s that we spin up ourselves. How did we discover that it was like crypto miners, just like using our EC2s to try to do something?
I think those were like a GPU heavy EC2s that they spin up. Those like XXL GPU specific. I forget what was the most powerful GPU at the time. But yeah, I remember them being like very GPU intense. So that was the only thing that would give them as much money in such a short amount of time. And at the time, I think we still have that philosophy. Maybe we'll be more careful about it now. But the philosophy has always been, we just trust our engineers and we give them the keys where they can spin up their own resources without our approval. But yeah, at the time, I think I just gave them admin access, admin keys to our interns for our whole account. And even though it was like a dev account, they still had access to whatever they want. And the problem, we quickly revoked that access key, but we didn't know how to programmatically shut everything down. Because I'm pretty sure they use some script to automatically spin up them ECL repos and then do all this stuff. So we spent the whole night manually going through each widget and shutting down every EC2 manually.
Oh, that was so painful. And I remember we were just hotspotting at this point. There was no Wi-Fi. We're hotspotting. And luckily we got one of those SIM cards with a shit ton of data. So we could do it. And I remember just like divide and conquer. Hey man, you take all the west and I take all the east. And by east, east of the world, not like east of the US. And they were just manually going through every single region, terminating each of the EC2 instances basically manually until all of them have been taken down. And this was like on our last day on the trip. I think the next day we were flying out and it was just such a hectic way to end like a short trip that was meant to be like, let's relax a little bit before things get really busy. And that was just on the last day. That was crazy. I'm still impressed. So basically, there are crypto miners or other actors out there that are just watching open GitHub repos and they're scanning to see if there's AWS keys that are shared in them. And as soon as they recognize one, they're just trying to spin up resources in them and having some scripts. What I'm impressed about is the level of sophistication of their DevOps. Like they're really good at DevOps. They have all this stuff set up. It's very impressive. I think they could use those skills for better values and services. Maybe at the time, crypto mining was still so generating a lot of money. And this was before really the whole hype cycle. So maybe they managed to mine something out of our AWS resources.
Yeah, I'm impressed by AWS.
In what way?
Because they're the ones that discovered that our keys got leaked.
That's
Those
true.
keys are still active and they emailed us. Hey guys, like keys are open.
They probably have some software running that it's similar to what we discover in fintech, where they have fraud monitoring. They probably have certain rules where it's like, hey, if you spin up like an EC2 in every single region in the world, probably there's something going on. Let's email the account owners with the key that spin up all those resources. So it's interesting how AWS probably has their like fraud monitoring team just watching for people like stealing AWS resources to do all sorts of stuff.
I wonder if you scout through GitHub or they just look at the resources being spun out on their AWS.
I don't know. I'd imagine it'll be very hard to do that, but AWS has those resources. So that was quite a wild, crazy story. I think it was an interesting story. I think we managed to solve the problem. We asked our intern to take down the key. We revoked them. We shut off everything. No major issue happened from that, but it was just like a interesting experience. Okay, so we are probably out of time now. I don't know if we want to wrap it up with a few stories about the journey that we missed.
I think one of the key topics is about when to hire DevOps, like contractors, or how to handle this.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll start. So at some point, managing everything yourself through console becomes very painful. But at the same time, as a startup, it's really hard to justify hiring DevOps, at least initially, because DevOps in general is very upfront heavy task because you have to do a lot of work to set everything up. You have to set up the accounts, you have to set up your Terraform script, whatnot. But then once you set everything up, it's very light work. If you want to do it yourself, it's also very painful because it's just such a broad field. Like you have to figure out how AWS works, their philosophy, their like IAM, their user management, all the resources that they have, how to configure the app. Terraform is like another language that you got to figure out. So it just covers a lot. Actually, the balance might be to start with something like CDK, AWS Cloud Development Kit. You can use your programming language of choice, and then you can set up your infrastructure with that. That would be a little bit more manageable, still better than console. Maybe you don't have to go as far as setting up your Terraform just yet. I've seen a couple startups that start with that and they got their shit together. So I'm impressed. But at least for our case, at some point, it just became very painful to manage everything with console, especially Lambdas. And then we decided to hire a consultant to help us with Terraform AWS management. Luckily, we had a friend who was DevOps, and then we were able to contract that friend to help us. That was the first time we set up SSO, we set up Terraform, we set up proper CI/CD, and I just remember being so delighted that I can just push my code and everything's just being updated properly, that I can easily scale up and down resources. To be fair, like I was just using it, but I didn't know how it worked. So when things broke, I was still dependent on that person, on our contractor to come online. Or like I would email him and, yo, can you help me? And then we'd have to wait. And that time, the product was down. So very quickly, I had to figure out how to troubleshoot and maintain those Terraform scripts myself. But for the initial setup, you still need a consultant. You still need a DevOps, someone who knows best practices as well.
Yeah, so it's not natural to most software developers, software engineers, how the whole cloud infra part works. Like it's different kind of like skill set and experience. You can build product, but then putting the product in production and spinning up the right configurations for your servers, different set of experiences. And so most startup founders, they don't come from a background where they already know how to scale and see all that, spin up infrastructure resources. They know how to build. And what's your recommendation? Should they just start setting it up, hiring someone to help them set up the initial minimal basic setup to make their lives way easier when it comes to development cycles, CI/CD, and push to prod, and then eventually hire someone full time? Or what's your recommendation to startups?
I would probably be more disciplined about DevOps. I would certainly be more disciplined about hygiene, like labeling, documenting all the resources properly. Now, that part is also a bit complicated because as you build your product, especially pre-product market fit, as you pivot, as your product evolves, it changes a lot. So your infrastructure changes, your requirements change as well. So that part, I'm not sure how to properly address. It's not like you can set up something once and then it's good. So you might need to get a consultant that can help you to set everything up. And then you still need to learn how to maintain this. But if I were to do it again, if it was a very simple product, I wouldn't hustle too much. I would just set up a SSO. I would set up the basic CI/CD. I would just use Beanstalk and Amplify, and that would be enough. Honestly, before product market fit, just use Heroku, Fly.io, something like Netlify, something that's managed for you, just so you can get started. I think even AWS is overkill for many startups, especially if your product is simpler. If you need to use AWS, I think it's worth investing into initial setup of your account. Then whenever you're looking for that DevOps consultant, just make sure it's someone you can trust because they got you. You can mess with them because they have access to your entire infrastructure. At any point, they can just wipe up your entire stack. They can delete your whole product. So trust is very critical when it comes to DevOps. So if you can find someone that is competent, but at the same time that you can trust, just hold on to them. It's your dear life because those are like some of the best, some of the key engineers that you'll have within your organization. Because we had experience with a bad DevOps as well. We contracted one DevOps who worked with us for 2 months for some crazy period and billed us for all this time. And then in all that time, all he did was just learn how our setup was configured and nothing new was deployed. One hack that I think we discovered is I wrote a script that just scoured through all the GitHub DevOps related repos and just look for contributors, look for developers of those scripts, and then just reach out to them and say, hey, would you be open for consulting or contract work? A lot of them is going to say no, but some of them might say yes. And that's how we were able to find our DevOps.
And that's great. That's a great advice for startups starting out. I'm really nothing else to add. That was our experience. Reach out if you have questions, if you need help. We've gone through this whole setup and we've gone through a lot of the mistakes of spinning up infrastructure, not labeling it, not setting up DevOps correctly. So yeah, just reach out if you need some help with this. We can point you in the right direction. All right. I think it's a good time to end the live talk now. So we'll have, I think we're going to do this weekly. So we'll come up with some interesting topics to talk about. Reach out if you have some topics you'd like us to talk about. So we'll see you next week.